Schön, dass Sie alle wieder da sind, sich gestärkt haben und vielleicht.
Ladies and gentlemen, well, I'm very pleased to have you back here. I hope you got some refreshments here. I heard that the first presentation, the first panel was so interesting that we missed out on the presentation by the GIZ, but we hope, Mrs. Gunnar, that we'll make up for that. So I would like to welcome the panel for that. And so we want to debate the very simple question as to whether climate change, climate protection is the formula for a better world, and how we can achieve that, where the problems are, where the barriers are. I would like to present the panel to you. Tanja Gönner, she's the head of the board for the German Society for International Cooperation, the GIZ. And I think you've been working in this field for an eternity, and we will meet in Bonn again in November, and I hope that the voice of the developing countries will be made better heard. So warm welcome to you. So at the far end, we have Ken Alex. You heard him very briefly during the first round when he said a few words on emission trades in California. And he is the senior policy advisor, that's the name, so the closest advisor to Governor Brown. He, together with Mr. Untersteller, took the initiative to found the Under 2 Alliance, and he's been traveling around a lot, and he will also be present at the climate conference in Bonn. I'm looking forward to that. Maybe we'll have some time for an interview at the Bonn conference. So Ken Alex, a warm welcome to you. And then from the lovely federal state of Lower Saxony, well, I was born in Hanover, the capital of Lower Saxony, and I would like to welcome the environment minister of the federal state of Lower Saxony. So he is here not only in his capacity as the environment minister of this federal state, but he will also sign or give a signature, because he will sign a membership to the initiative. So warm welcome to Mr. Wenzel. And I would also like to welcome another Stefan Kapferer. He is head of the board and member of the board of the Federal Association of Energy and Water Suppliers. So the utilities, that is those who are very attentive here, who are heavily involved in the energy transition with all the disadvantages that this entails. So warm welcome to you, Mr. Kapferer. And next to me, there's Jochen Flassbart, State Secretary in the Federal Ministry for Environment Protection, Nuclear Safety and Construction. And for many years, he has been the driving force in international climate policy. Whenever I wanted to contact him, I always heard that he was traveling around South America, South Africa, wherever, in order to convince the reluctant people there to become active in the field of climate policy. This paid off. The last big success was the climate agreement, or the Paris Agreement, and the German delegation did have a big stake in the success. And we are looking forward to what the outcome will be of the Bonn conference. I don't know, will it be called Fiji-Bonn Agreement or whatever? So I would like to start with you, Mr. Flaxbart. So we look towards America, to the United States, and ask ourselves, why Donald Trump and others are wrong if they believe that climate change doesn't take place and that climate change is negotiable? What is wrong about that? So I would like to convince them of the opposite, but I'm not trying that, because I was the first high-ranking European to meet Mr. Pritch, the environment minister in the United States. I noticed that he is quite a charming person, but my charm is not sufficient to convince him of the existence of climate change. So the headline of and to hammer home the topic of this panel here, that climate change is necessary to make the world a better place, or at least to make it, to not make it a worse place. And in Paris, we managed to agree on the climate agreement. I think we did quite a good job. So similar to the Italians with the G7. So G7 -1, and similar to that with G20, we managed to achieve something with G20 -1. So, but I think we don't have to travel all the way to the United States to meet people who have to do some catching up and who need some convincing. I think we only have to look at our own country. If we look at the last life of our parliament, I think there were only very few people with whom we didn't get into conflict with regard to climate change, and we have not really made the most decisive steps that would actually be necessary. And so we can ask ourselves, we get a lot of support in our own country, but why don't we get better and more appropriate outcomes here either? So the reason for that is that too many people who are stubborn, who don't see that we have to phase out coal more quickly than we do, and that we have to work more towards energy transition, and that we cannot continue with our trench wars on e-mobility and electro cars. And if the danger is that we will lag behind. So if I may express a wish for the next life of our parliament, we have to become more quickly. We have to stop those who try to put a brake on this whole process, and they have to move back into the second line. So let's have a look at what you will be able to do after the next election to elect Ken Allen. Why do Trump and others believe that climate protection is negotiable?
Okay. So looking into the mind of Trump is not my specialty. I think that for Trump, everything is negotiable, and there's not a lot of deep belief. So if the oil and gas industries in the United States want to go in the direction of walking away from climate, that's where the United States for the time being is heading. In a 2-week period, San Francisco hit an all-time high of 100, and as you noted, 106 degrees Fahrenheit, about 42 or 43 Celsius. That was at the same time that we've had 2 of the largest hurricanes ever to hit the United States mainland. So I'm not sure that we have to spend a lot of time talking about when will Trump change. I think that the odds are that the public will get there before he does, and already 70% of Americans believe that we need to act on climate change. Unfortunately, that has not translated to votes, and it may be the same for all of you as well, that climate has not driven elections. And that, to me, is where we have to start making some of that change so that we connect voters' understanding of the future with the candidates that they vote for. So, obviously, California is different, and we're happy to say that we are. But one thing that is a silver lining here is that there's now more attention paid to climate change and to the Paris Agreement than had ever occurred in the United States before Trump made an issue of it. So take that for what you will.
Okay, das ist dann die positive Nachricht in noch nicht mal 5 Minuten der ersten Runde.
That is the positive piece of news. even as quickly as 5 minutes after the beginning of our panel. So Trump announced that the United States want to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. It has been announced so far, it has not yet been implemented, but this will bring about some discussion at the Bonn conference. Among others, there will be the question as to whether the United States will continue with its commitment that are included in the Paris Agreement. Mrs. Güttner, this is also a question to you. I'm thinking in particular of the funds that have been earmarked in order to help the developing countries to take measures to adapt to the climate change, whatever is needed for that. It has always been one of the main sticking points at the climate conferences, and well, maybe you could give an assessment of that. So how dramatic is the situation? Will the Americans not meet their obligations, that is, not make any payments, and thus make a big contribution towards towards changing the whole process at the COP? What is your assessment of that?
In the budget that they will not make payment to the Green Fund. So not surprisingly, the answer is that is not a source of funding any further from the United States for the time being. So I think there will be some ways to make up some of it, but it's a big change, and we're going to have to figure out different financing mechanisms. California, along with others, are thinking about mechanisms for subnationals, and we're thinking through how we might partner with private finance, and I think that's a pretty big challenge.
Okay. Da würde ich auch gerne Frau Gönner.
And here I would like to ask Mrs. Gönner and Jochen Flassbart to comment on that. What does this mean for the continuation of the climate conferences and for development cooperation? Well, of course, the Americans won't pay, as Ken said, so that would be illogical. So this was announced, and that was one of the reasons. Well, they always said that if they regard something as not useful, then it wouldn't make sense to pay for it. I'm quite sure that this won't paralyze the COP. So we had a very intensive debate on finance here, and I think we have now reached a different stage. So I think I can say that with the partners of the climate conference, we will make sure that the climate secretariat will continue to be in a position to perform its task. That is not witchery. These are sums that are manageable. So what we are not going to do is that with the financial obligations of financial commitments of the United States with regard to the Green Climate Fund, and that we won't pay with these £1 billion pounds. Not so not. If one partner is not loyal, then it's not the right answer to say that we will make up for that and come in and pay that. And I think the developing countries and the emerging countries will understand that. So we will not step in. The atmosphere is no longer as aggressive as it used to be. Of course, we need government funds, in particular for adaptation, for mitigation, and but the stronger focus is on creating the right framework conditions for green investment, so that we steer the capital funds and investments into the right direction. I think India understood that, so I think we have progressed in our negotiations to a next stage. And that is why I asked him to answer first, because so the question as to whether anybody will replace the funds that the Americans won't pay, I think that is a political question, so we cannot step in for others. And I think the more important point here for us in Bonn is implementation. So I think after Paris, there was the conference in Marrakesh, and they dealt with the question of implementation, namely the question as to what did not used to be a commitment and is now a commitment, and how can we implement that. So I think similar to Mr. Flassbart's view, the developing and the emerging countries are working more and more on implementation. So we have this NDC partnership, and more of these countries want to participate in that. And we now have to think about how to give these countries the support they need. What kind of framework conditions do they need? Where do they need funding? And Green Climate Fund is one source of money, and I think it is necessary to use it for leverage on the traditional financial markets. And here I think the advantage is that we can start at an early point with implementation to work along the plans, and we can contribute to that through our experience, through the sharing of knowledge, through bringing together the different countries so that they can share experience. And then we have to move towards specific planning and the concrete implementation of specific projects. If we talk about project implementation, this regards funding. So we have the Green Climate Fund, $100 billion is a good sum of money. And if I use this to leverage funds from private markets, then this is a lot of money. And so the American share will at some point be a gap in this 100 billion funds, in this fund of $100 billion, but we will be able to leverage other funds. And we now have to strengthen those who show a lot of commitment, and we have to join them on this path. I think this has always been a part of the UN climate conferences, namely sharing of knowledge, sharing of possibilities, finding new partnerships. And I think this has been a major topic. And here, that is where the interfaces to the ANA 2 initiatives. Mr. Kaffer, from your point of view, where do you see a possibility to come in at your level? Where can you contribute at your level when it comes to new partnerships? So the spirit that we have invoked here today, where can you start new projects with this spirit? Because the doors are wide open at the UN level. If I may answer to that, so I watched this from the outside for a long time, from a regional perspective, maybe. And I was as frustrated as many others after the Copenhagen conference. And then I went to Warsaw and said, well, that I wanted to get a better understanding of why such conferences often fail. And for me, it was interesting to see how the Chinese acted there. In Warsaw, the Chinese had a very close look at what the local authorities did, what the towns and municipalities do, what the civil society organizations do in terms of projects. And they asked very practically questions about the amount of investment, whether this was worth it, whether this was cost efficient, whether it made sense environmentally speaking and economically, and whether there were any case studies that could have been meaningful for them. And this was a point of departure for me, on the basis of which we discussed possibilities to strengthen the role of the local authorities, the role of local and regional initiatives, so that they could act as a stronger driving force in this process. So if a head of government then would come along and said that, well, we have to save this money, and if then Lord Mayor comes along and says, well, we have already reached this point, and so, for example, Lower Saxony produces 2/3 of its energy supply from renewables, and that is a practical example to push the whole process into the right direction. That is why I believe that this initiative that started in California and Baden-Württemberg, that this initiative is a very good and wonderful process, similar to ICLE or this Alliance of Towns and Cities. And these initiatives should not be underrated, because some of the heads of government that sat around the table had to be were pushed, basically. They weren't there out of their own intrinsic motivation, and in order to pressurize them, to push them forward, and to see where our levers are for a continuation of the process, that is the main point now. And with regard to the United States, I don't think that there will be others who follow the example of the United States, because the economic situation is as such that in many cases renewables can compete with fossil fuels. At least with regard to new investment. If you want to make new investment, then renewables are often the better solution, and they are also economically speaking the better solution.
Für Sie, das Thema
the modernization potential. Let's talk about that. Well, Jochen Fass already said we're in a second step, in a second phase of the process, and the second phase definitely is one that has to talk more about the business cases, business models, prosperity, addition potential, because we in Germany look at the debate under the aspect of whether some part of the population might lose prosperity. For many parts of the world, these technologies and these innovations that we see now mean additional prosperity, new prosperity and added value. I think this is a very important point. Many said Donald Trump is a bad politician, but some people thought he was a good businessman. I think his decision was a bad business decision, because basically they are not using resources and potential that is huge. So decentralized solutions, if we need renovation, we need modernization, these aren't going to be centralized processes, especially if you look at the transportation system in Germany. Everybody knows if we wait for the 14 million cars are going to be electric vehicles, we'll wait till the end of days. We need different types of understanding of mobility, and the regions and the cities will play a central role here. So I think it's very logical that my association is very much looking at the energy efficiency networks, where one tries to develop new innovation, new potential. I think this is the path, and not so much centralized systems. Let me say something about the modernization potential, and let me ask you, Ken Alex. Coincidentally, I spent 3 weeks in California, and I looked at the country very well and was able to look at it. When there is Labor Day, then the motorways, 6 lanes, are completely blocked. I've never seen so much metal on one spot. It was sensational. Luckily, I was going in the other direction, so that was okay. And even when people are on vacation, you're always thinking, oh my God, how are the Americans ever going to get a transition in their transportation system? That can never work. Ken Alex, I'm sure you know, and you think it will work.
So to give you a sense of it, Californians drive 500 billion kilometers a year. Yeah. So, figure out how many thousand times to the sun that is. So yeah, 40 to 50% of emissions in California come from the transportation sector. This is our key set of challenges. There's 3 pillars of what we have to do. One is to change the vehicles. Part of that is electric and hydrogen non-polluting vehicles. We've got about 250,000 of them on the road. Our goal is 1.5 million by 2025. And then after that, it has to ramp up very substantially. I can't remember the number of vehicles on the road in California, but it's something like 32 million, which is just less than 1 per person. So we have to change the vehicles, and we have to change the mode, as you just mentioned, to much more public transportation. We're putting a lot of financing and funding and grants into transit-oriented development. So higher densities located near transportation options. I'm sure that doesn't sound familiar to any of you. So California is, I can't say this in the United States, but we're moving closer to a European model of how to combine living space with transportation options. And there's a very substantial amount of investment in that set of options. So the second piece of that is land use. California is a little different because we have, even with 39 million people, we have a lot of land. And that's part of why we have these large driving distances. So we have to think differently about how we develop land. We have a high-speed rail project from California, from Los Angeles to San Francisco in process. And you can imagine a future in where every high-speed rail station has acres of parking. But instead, what we're trying to do is to make those hubs of transit so that you can connect more densely populated urban areas, preserve open space, preserve agriculture. And then the third piece is how do we change the fuel, whether it's hydrogen or electricity or biofuel, and we have incentives to do just that. And then, this is a whole other topic, but there's a revolution coming very quickly called autonomous vehicles, probably faster than we're prepared for. So how do we have policies that make autonomous vehicles both zero emission and multi-passenger? And that's a challenge that we're working on right now.
Okay, da ist noch einiges zu tun, aber viel auf dem richtigen.
So there's still a lot to do, but a lot is going in the right direction. But for many years, I've been thinking about one issue. Where is the communication on this topic? If we're talking about the energy transition in Germany, they're always talking about the law relating to renewable energies, and everybody says it's expensive and they want their nice nuclear power plants back. What went wrong? Why do people don't understand that the modernization factor, which we've just talked about, why don't people obviously not understand that this is connected with the climate issue? Luckily, there's only very few people who want to go back to nuclear power in Germany. Do you still have any in your association? No. Because they have very intelligent economists, so they wouldn't have this. But I think the greater issue is that we're not only talking about modernization. We all think that's smart because it looks smart. They talk about the positive aspects. But I'm more and more convinced that we have to talk more honestly about how can the transformation take place to a more modern technology, which moves away from something as well. What I have observed in our country is that there is a huge fear, and we looked at the Trump election in America. What happens if there is a middle that is left behind, which see themselves the losers in a modernization process, and then become victim of illiberal forces which have different phases in different parts of the world, but basically favor marginalized parts of society? And the panic in the established party system is so big that one is afraid to communicate these truths. And that is why they're not honest enough about saying goodbye to what is old, and that is why there is not enough structural policy. That is what I believe. One example, and you can look at the transport transformation. The automobile industry, in any case, sees its future in electric mobility. They say that when the cameras have been turned off the record. But the worry is there's a whole supply chain. You don't need a transmission anymore. You don't need exhaust systems anymore. This is a medium-sized industry, which is in Baden-Württemberg is very well developed. So there really are going to be loss of jobs because of this transformation. So what happens after that? And more I'm hearing about in the debates, one can say, you could have something like synthetic fuels. Then you could have the combustion engine. You just need a new transmission and a new exhaust system. You just use new fuels on the based on renewable energy. So what I know is that synthetic fuels need not one wind turbine, but 7 wind turbines to manufacture. And so then the same people who say in their own state say they don't want wind energy, but say, oh, well, why don't we have synthetic fuels? And they don't know that the two are connected. So modernization needs a path. We have to communicate that. It doesn't have to be too restricted, but you can exclude certain technologies because they wouldn't make a contribution because they don't fill certain preconditions. And then they always talk about technology, and one can be open to technology and nonetheless say which technology certainly does make a contribution. If one asks, what do uranium, coal, diesel, and copper have in common? All of these are 4 commodities which have an important function in our economy. We've made the biggest changes in the nuclear power law in 30 years, and we got a lot of laws and a consensus relating to this topic. Where coal is concerned, this is still pending. Where nuclear power is concerned, the companies who are involved here were almost bankrupt. So how is this going to continue with coal and diesel and copper, where we have a similar debate with the telecom and glass fibers? So the question keeps arising: how does a country such as ours, an export champion, has high salaries and lives off innovations and the ability to always come up with the state-of-the-art product, the most innovative product, and to be technology leaders? So how do we manage to reach the point of transformation on time and to recognize it before others do it? Where nuclear energy is concerned, we waited too long. Where coal is concerned, we're at risk of waiting too long. And where diesel is concerned, we're waiting too long as well. If the Chinese, not in 2030, but maybe in 3 or 4 years, in inner cities have a 100% quota for electric vehicles, then the European automobile industry will lose a huge market. The Chinese would do that for environmental reasons, but also for industrial reasons. Mr. Kozeng says that I sit in a cafe on one side of the road and I can't recognize the buildings on the other side of the road on some days, then one knows that the Chinese have good reason to take these radical measures. And that is basically the central question for an economy such as ours. How can they anticipate these types of cycles so there isn't only a change once you've already hit the wall? That is a very good question. I'm not quite sure whether the economy has the power to do that for intelligent reasons. And let me give you a short anecdote. When Klaus Tepfer was the Minister for the Environment, I interviewed him, and he says, what I just told you, I don't believe myself. Lots of things are going to happen until the next disaster. And then we just basically sat down, had a beer. I would just like to say hello to the present Environmental Minister, Ms. Hendricks. So the Wuppertal Institute have been dealing for many years with this transformation issue. Mr. Kapfer, how do you have this discussion? If we add the electric vehicle in the background, there are lots of efforts in order to make the German grids capable, in order to be able to deal with a big net of infrastructure for electric vehicles. It's not about the amount of energy, but the distribution of the energy. So a lot has to be done in the infrastructure. What about this debate, and what will we be facing, and Are there any cost estimates so far? What would this aspect of electric mobility cost, i.e. retrofitting the grids? Well, that will depend on the speed of the breakthrough of electric mobility. We just heard that some industries are running the risk of missing this change. My industry almost missed this change. So for us, this is a growth prospect. Electric mobility is a growth prospect for the energy industry. 1 million electric vehicles means 1.5% more electricity consumption. That doesn't have to frighten us, but we have to look how we can organize this intelligently. So the actual added value potential won't be created by utilities setting up charging stations. At the end of the week, we will publish the new figures, and here we see a double-digit growth where the charging stations are concerned. So that infrastructure is coming. But we have to manage them intelligently and smartly. How can I use batteries as storage places? How can I charge and discharge at the same time? What are the additional services in a charging station? So this is the innovation potential that would be interesting in other parts of the world. We don't exist by just having cheap manufacturing processes. That's not German know-how. Other people can do that better. But we have to be very innovative in terms of services and overall concepts. And I think e-mobility has a huge opportunity for my industry and the whole economy. So I think here, nobody really wants to take the leading position. I can't see who's leading in electric mobility. Is this sort of basically hopping around and waiting for somebody to take the first step and then to follow? You said in Lower Saxony you've got a lot of renewable energies, a lot of wind power. So what is your feeling? Is everybody waiting for the other person to take the first step? No, I think where renewable energy is concerned, and also the synthetic of the expansion of renewable energies, energy efficiency, and digitization. A lot is happening here. And digitization has to be always included because that will give the whole thing a whole new additional innovation impetus where the automobile industry is concerned. I believe that the managers and the owners of the big automobile companies, not only in Lower Saxony, simply didn't realize what was happening and where it was happening, and they didn't want to believe that new developments will happen, which have to be integrated and taken into account in the corporate policy. 10 years ago, one tried to flood or to betray the American market with that went terribly wrong. And how can the transformation now happen with the necessary speed? I think when the electric vehicle was introduced, fundamental errors were made. One should, first of all, have to go into the care-sharing fleets, taxi fleets, company fleets, or postal fleets. The post was so desperate that nobody was able to offer a car like that they created their own company. These were markets that could have been developed at the time without the whole topic of the range and reach would have played a role, because a postal van only drives for 170 kilometers a day. And a car sharing doesn't need a range of 500 kilometers at all. So this is where one should have started, bit by bit. One should have developed the markets in the cities without having to expose oneself to the discussion of where the next charging station is. Because when you have a fleet operation, you have 2, 3, or 5 charging stations on the site. And there you can charge your whole fleet. So it'll be interesting to see now how the next steps will be taken and who will actually take the lead. The first opportunity has already been missed. We can't catch up on that. Digitization was another buzzword you just mentioned. Ms. Gönnert, of course, that is on a very high level. We are thinking about autonomous cars and things like that, but the countries that you're dealing with normally, by the GIZ would be happy if they had already reached that point. What does that transformation that we're discussing now mean for development work? I think a lot of things will play a role. Since Klaus Töpfer was mentioned earlier on, there is also one thing that he kept saying, i.e. the task of the industrialized countries is technology becomes so cheap that it can be used in developing countries afterwards. So let's be happy that we achieved that, because we did. The fact that in many developing countries today, we can build up energy grids or enabling access to energy. That is something we have to talk about as well. In Africa, in Asia, and in Latin America, there are a lot of countries still where we are talking about access to energy, where decentralized systems are not a transformation but an opportunity to get access to energy in the first place. And this is, we need products that don't compete with big systems. That is what we've contributed, and it's about working together with the countries in the development work and saying rural areas that today have no contact to an energy grid have to be provided with off-grid decentralized solutions to set up rural energy, and that would be a big step. And second point, if sometimes I note that the telephone connections in Africa are a lot better than in Germany. And I know in Baden-Württemberg, I haven't been there for 6 years, but the dead spots there are no different. I couldn't hear that, unfortunately. But sometimes we have to be careful that we really have an OPIC, and that is a concern that relates to the mobile net and the internet. In Africa, sometimes you've got approaches that go further than what we do. So in the developing countries today, you have payment systems that we don't even know about here, because that is the only possibility for them to have access to financial services. And I think this is what is very interesting. That's one thing that we have to say. So we're creating, in many countries, a transformation to allowing them to develop and set up frameworks for their own development. And the second point is interesting because China keeps being mentioned. We had a discussion in 2007 relating to air pollution. Even then one said that very soon only electric mobility will be used there. And there was a discussion in 2007 because one could see that this was going to happen. But there was a very tough competition there. So the question is, can we still compete here in this competition? And thirdly, in the developing countries, of course, on a global level, we have many developing countries where you have very strong urbanization. And especially there, the question is, how do I build up cities that are sustainable so that they're just not a collection of slums? Look at the cities in Asia and in Africa that are being created at the moment. So we have to think about how do we have to advise cities relating to sustainable mobility, sustainable supply of electricity in order to frog leap certain things. And here some developing countries are very, very interested in that. And they look very closely who's ahead here, because they think about who are they going to cooperate with and who is really the leaders in technology. So in development work, you have a mixture of using the existing technology and leapfrogging certain phases, and have areas where technologies are further advanced that I can bring together. And the topic also, how the industrialized countries compete in order to pick out what is best for oneself. And one doesn't only look at the markets, but we have to look what can we contribute, what are our strengths. And we in Germany have to think about what our strengths are, where can we provide support. And here we have huge potential to promote modernization, transformation in society, and guarantee development. So I would like to ask Ken Alex again, what is actually the driver for climate protection or sustainable development in general? Is it the modernization will? Is it the so-called better life? Is it the new markets that are very exciting? From a Californian point of view or American point of view, what is the driver?
Well, it has to be a combination of all of those things. I mean, we talk about a better world. That's great. I mean, in California, we want to get rid of air pollution, and that has some connection to greenhouse gas emissions, electric mobility, et cetera. I think a lot of people are excited about the possibility of autonomous vehicles. Obviously, California is the home to endless companies that want to digitalize everything. And now they're home to companies that have new ideas about cars and storage and combining all of these things. So there's absolutely an aspect of a better world, of technology being the solution, et cetera. But it is also the case that California has over 1,000 kilometers of coastline that is being subject to rising seas, and we've seen cliffs falling and houses going with them. We have heat waves and droughts. All the plagues are there. Lots of forest fires. And so there's an element here of needing to respond to huge environmental challenges. And so some of that appeals to a part of the population, some of it's technology. I think ultimately, probably the solution and the putting it in the frame of optimism, which I think is important, particularly for, talk to college kids who say, this is too big, we can't deal with this, so we're just going to live our lives. You have to have solutions, and you have to present optimism. So I think that part of it is really going to, for California, is going to be about technology.
Wir haben, die Kurve zu kriegen,
Well, to come back to Dr. Eden Kofer, whom we listened to at the beginning at this meeting here, we still have the problem that coal is a very strong sector, globally speaking. So the production of coal has not reduced. The price of coal and other fossil fuels are at a long time low, and Edenhofer also said that this is going to stay this way for the next years or even decades. And he also said that we have to increase our efforts to an extreme extent in order to meet the climate objectives until 2050. Well, we now have national elections forthcoming, and the question could be, well, it's nice to have such lovely discussions, but what if things are getting very tight and the EU is trying to make everything so tight that they will have infringement procedures for countries who do not stick to the EU legislation, and then this will also be so what will be the strict and necessary measures that will make sure that we stick to the climate objectives that California and Baden-Württemberg and others have agreed upon. So, State Secretary, what is the debate in your Federal Ministry of the Environment? What are the measures? So the first remark here is that we have to start quickly. In the last 4 years, we have not been able to close the gap that exists for us, and we have not made much headway with regard to closing this gap. And the reason for that is that for the last 20 years, it has not been possible for us to measure exactly the reduction rates. And of course, it is part of human nature to always think that the neighbor can go ahead and do things first. So for 2030, we have laid down sector-specific targets, and I am firmly convinced, that this has to be cast into a law. So they've been agreed upon, and I think regardless of who carries out the negotiations, if we don't cast this into law, then this will just vanish again. And the third thing that I learned from the debates of the last few years is that now we have to think about the problems about which we have not yet thought sufficiently. So we know this from energy transition. It is not an environment problem. It is not an economic problem. It's a social problem. And the same holds true for transport, transition and transport mode. I think here we have the technologies already. Of course, we still have to do some learning. And I think we now have to think about the next topic. This is a transitional industry. How can we get cement emissions-free and other things emission-free? So if we take these three strands together, that urbanization and transport, according to the Habitat 3 directive, we know that in the next 20, 30 years, we will have to build all the buildings once again. If we did, we have to replace the existing buildings. If we do this with cement, then we have greenhouse gas emissions without any limits. And for that, we need an enormous effort in terms of research and development in order to get this done in cement that is emission-free. So you can do that with investors and here I think the government is called upon. You cannot only do this through private investors who only look at their return on investment. So here the government is called upon, and we have to find out how we can avoid mistakes that we committed with regard to transport and energy, and how can we avoid the repetition of such mistakes in an important sector like housing. So I think Mr. Flassbart is right. For my sector, it holds true what is written down in the Habitat directive, so the reduction of the emission gases. It is possible. So until 2030, part of the coal-powered power station has to be taken off the grid. But these are the power plants that are 20 or 30 years old. I think it is feasible. There's no problem, technically speaking. This means new construction of gas power plants. So I have to talk about that honestly. Nobody builds them at the moment because there's no reasonable funding framework for that. But it is technically speaking feasible. And I'm sure we will manage. So I'm quite surprised that to hear that Flassbart is so much against power to X, because power to gas, power to coal. Because the last sector that he mentioned, cement, aluminium, and others. So the question is, do we have these synthetic? So I think there's one point is right here with regard to what he said. These products will not be produced in Germany because we do not have enough we will never have enough renewable energies in Germany to produce all these emission-free products. But what is the problem about convincing Qatar and Saudi Arabia and others that they won't sell any fossil fuels in future, and that instead they could produce solar energy. So I think that could be of help, and that could lead to next transformation step in Germany. Of course, we need these BTL technologies in many areas, kerosene and in other industry processes and so on, and where we can make this more effective, where we don't waste a factor 7. We should do it in areas where it is more efficient, but I'm not speaking out against modern technologies. Well, in Lower Saxony, we had a 2-year process where we got more than 50 organizations around a table, from the steelworks to the environment protection group, and also the Association of Chemical Industries, and we asked them what is the economically and ecologically most efficient way to reach the climate objective until the year that is fixed. And we had this written down by some scholars from a university, and we need power to liquid, power to X on the storage side as well, and that is why we now have to start with the technologies to make this big jump. We need pilot plants that can produce 60 MBs and megawatts, and we have to be able to do this jump. And now we need the regulation for that. And the regulations, for example, in areas where the electric grid is being expanded. Well, so we have some problems with the enlargement of the electric grid for wind power, and but we need the first models where we can use power to X for industry, for example. So there's solar or hydrogen plant. There are some industries that could use solar or hydrogen energy, and we could also use the gas network instead of the electricity grid in order to transport energy to the south, or electricity to the south. I think this is also part of your work, Mrs. Gunnar, and this technology that is taken from Germany, from the EU, and transported to other countries to do this Power to X project and this transformation. Are there any projects of this kind in the southern countries? Well, not yet, I think. But what we do in some of these countries, when I think about Saudi Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula, there are some ideas as to how. Well, they are thinking about how to produce their own energy out of renewables for their own. They don't talk about heating, of course, but about irrigation, for example. And in many countries, we start by supporting infrastructures, or start by helping with the construction of these infrastructures, help with the financing of that. So in particular in North Africa, we have energy partnerships that are about building the necessary infrastructure for their own energy supply. And this could be expanded any time in order to make this other step as well. But the main focus for these countries is to supply their own energy through renewables. But once they have reached that point, they can, of course, export that and expand. So I think we have now heard and debated a whole range of interesting possibilities. And to conclude, I would like to ask a last question to Ken Alex. So what do you believe would be necessary to happen in Germany in terms of energy transition so that this would hit the headlines of the San Francisco Chronicle?
Ending your nuclear power got headlines in California for sure. And we joined you. Our last electric power plant is going to shut down in 2024. So that's one. Second, you got headlines by having more solar power than California. At one point, you're a little farther north than we are. So we were impressed with that as well, and that got reported. So and you got a third headline, which was perhaps not as favorable, that you're not going to meet some of your targets. So now, how do we how do we get to 100%, and how do we do it quickly? So if Germany, for example, can lead on energy storage, you just talked about some of the possibilities. Conversion to hydrogen is a form of storage. There are other possibilities around electric vehicles and using them vehicle to grid. Well, maybe Germany can take the lead on any of a number of those things. I suspect you will get to 100% renewables about the same time or maybe before us, and that will be a headline.
Okay, vielen Dank. Okay, also, Rahmenbedingungen sind gesteckt. Wer eine Schlagzeile
I think the framework conditions are clear. Those who want to hit the headlines in California, that was how to do it. So we would like to thank all the panelists, and climate protection, broad sustainable development covers a whole broad range of subjects, and we can debate this only because renewables now are marketable, and so we need renewables plus digitalization that makes it possible to digitize, to market renewable energies, and well, thank you very much. Volker Ratzmann now has the floor.
So, first of all, I would like to thank the excellent moderator for a really successful moderation of these discussions. Thank you very much for taking the time. And I would like to thank all the participants of these two panels. Both panels gave us very new, interesting information. They represented the discussion that we're having and have to have. And I would like to thank all of you, especially that you came and to discuss this topic with us today. So thank you to everybody, and a round of applause for all the panelists. And now the nice part of the evening. You heard in the keynote only the pessimists are successful. And Ms. Clarkson said she would like to hear some optimism. And I think this is an optimistic part of today's event. At the beginning of the event, we got a video message from our Minister President Christman, and you will have heard a passage which is called "We can welcome 2 new members to Alliance," and we would like to do that now. And you're going to do that. Thank you very much for handing the floor to me. And I would like to thank Mr. Ratzmann and everybody else here in the representation of Baden-Württemberg here. I know how much work such an event is in terms of organization and so on. So I would like to have a round of applause for all the organizers. And the person who was most responsible was the representative of the Ministry for the Environment, Justus Koch. And I think this is your success today, Justus. 2015 in California, we started officially with 12 initial signatories of the MOU under 2. Baden-Württemberg, California were the leaders, but there were a number of others, members, Ontario, Quebec, and the 2 from Mexico, and Paraná and Catalonia, and so on and so forth. And then it progressed step by step, and we showed you earlier on, we now have 175 regions from 6 continents, 35, 36 countries that are participating. We've got endorsing partners as well. I would like to thank Jochen Flassbart, who supported that the federal government became an endorsing partner. And today we are 1.2 billion people are represented in these regions. Almost 40% of the world economic power output is represented. So it's the world's biggest subnational alliance for climate protection. And I would like to thank Jochen Flassbart because we need a financial basis, and the organization is done by a climate group in London. Thank you very much as well. And we are financed by different sources. On the American side, the Rockefeller Foundation, and by the International Climate Initiative. 3.4 million is what we get from them. I would like to thank the BMU and Jochen for the support, because these funds make the things possible that we couldn't do otherwise, especially supporting the countries on the southern hemisphere if we're talking about measuring, reporting, verification, and so on. Today we've got 2 new members, and I would like to invite the 2 gentlemen onto the stage, or one lady, sorry. The Minister for the Environment of Rhineland-Palatia, and Stefan Wenzel, who is the Minister for the Environment from Lower Saxony. And they are now going to sign the certificate. Ken Alex, would you please come forward as a representative of California who initiated that idea at the time? And we will just watch it to make sure we're witnesses to make sure everything is done properly. We are now 177 regions. And I hope that together with the Californians, with our Californian friends, up until the COP23, we will reach a figure of 180. We're very honored that you signed this. This was a great ending to today, the 5th Summer Academy. Thank you very much to all of you that you've made this possible here. I've already said a lot of thanks, so let me just say it's great that you came and that you're actually in Baden-Württemberg. And our tradition is that nobody leaves with being hungry or thirsty. We are still a donor country, and that is why we like to give you something. I would like to invite you to have something to eat, to have something to drink, enjoy our specialities, come back to our events, and wonderful that you all came.